two handouts. It's not because we're going to try to pick up the pace. We're already going pretty fast, but if you were here with us last week, you know that I didn't make it very far. Kind of my own fault here. Didn't utilize the time in the proper way. So we didn't really get through the first two chapters of Romans. So I told you this week we're going to try to pick up on that. Hopefully we'll finish out that lesson, and the plan is to kind of start 355, and then Lord willing next week finish up. Just to kind of remind you, I know it's been a week here, but Paul begins the book of Romans with kind of a general introduction. He talks about the idea that he had longed and planned to visit the church at Rome for some time, but he'd been hindered, and so he just hadn't been able to make the journey. Remember, he wanted to go there for what purpose? Or at least one of the purposes, I guess. Yeah, to impart spiritual gifts, which is probably an indication that no apostle had been to the area of Rome yet. So Paul was the chosen by Jesus to be the apostle to the Gentiles. And he says in verse 15 there of chapter 1, he felt a debt to go and to visit them. He felt that he had an obligation because he was the apostle to the Gentiles to go there and to impart to them some of these spiritual gifts. Again, Paul just kind of introduces himself and gives a little bit of background information about his desire to visit with them. But the real discussion in the first part of the book of Romans deals with the concept of righteousness. And of course, before you can start talking about righteousness, or before you can have a full discussion about righteousness, you have to talk about unrighteousness, don't you? Be trying to talk to somebody about salvation without talking about sin. Could you do that? I don't know how you could, do you? Be real hard. And the same is true when it comes to righteousness. And so Paul begins his discussion of righteousness by really talking about unrighteousness. And what he deals with there in the last part of Romans chapter 1 is the unrighteousness of the Gentile world. Now, Paul's going to kind of draw a separation here, for lack of better terms, between the Jews and the Gentiles. But he's doing it to show them that they are alike in every way. Although they may think that they're different, and although they may view each other differently, they were really one and the same when it came to the problem of unrighteousness and the problem of sin and the solution of salvation. And so what we talked about there in Romans chapter 1 was the present condition of the Gentile world. And really when you study the Roman civilization, you're going to see a lot of these attitudes, these qualities present within the civilization of Rome itself, the citizens and the people of Rome themselves. But Paul talked about, if you go down to about question, we're somewhere in number 8 here again, we're on 354 here, the ones dealing with Romans chapters 1 and 2. But the question was, what happens to the hearts and the minds and the actions of people who reject God? How does Paul describe the Gentile world there?
He said the heart was darkened.
Yeah. What does the thinking and the mind of man become like whenever they reject God?
Usually they just pursue pleasure, whatever kind it may be.
Yeah, and if you look through that list there, Paul starts talking about, let's see, where does the list start? In about verse 29 there, if you look through some of the things that Paul describes the Gentile world, again, it's just really selfish pursuits. It's all about self-indulgence and self-pleasure. And that's sadly the state of those who reject God. They're going to elevate themselves. They're going to kind of put themselves at the top of everything that they think about and say and do. And everything is going to be about them and their pleasure and their happiness. And that was, in a nutshell, that was the Gentile world. He also talks about how, their thinking, they became foolish in their thinking. So a lot of times when a society rejects God, intelligence is lacking in the way that they think and the way that they process information. And again, if you look through what Paul wrote about in the Gentile world there in Romans chapter 1, what were some of the evidences of lack of intelligence when it came to their thinking?
Well, they're unmerciful for one thing.
Yeah, and that would be more of an action probably than a thought process. What did they do when they chose not to worship God? Who did they end up worshiping? Okay, idols. What else?
Most themselves professing to be wise.
Yeah, men. They started worshiping men. What else did they worship?
Well, in a way, I guess, what, the old covenant?
Well, yeah, for the Jew, but Paul's mainly talking about the Gentile here. And really what I was kind of driving at here, if you go down to about verse, let me see if I can find it real quickly here. Yeah, verse 23, they changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like unto corruptible man, and birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. So if man isn't going to worship God, who's he going to worship? He's either going to worship himself, some other man. He's going to worship creation. He's going to worship birds or, animals or, things that crawl on the ground. Or whatever. It's how debased man becomes in his thinking. And so it was evident as you looked at the Gentile world that they had rejected God because of the way that they thought and the way that they acted. And the fact that they were indulging themselves. And you also have a principle here. Were they open to change? No, they weren't open to truth or change, were they? And so there was no remorse. There was no penitence on their part. And the way that they dealt with each other in their relationships was a reflection that they had rejected God. Paul talks about the way that children treated their parents, and even the way that parents treated their children, and the way that relationships, basic human and social relationships, were broken. What about covenant or people who made covenants?
They were covenant breakers.
Yeah, covenant didn't mean anything to them, did it? You think about all those things, but question number 9 on our handout is, how common are those things that we just talked about and those specific sins that Paul listed in this passage? How common are they in our world today?
Haven't changed about that.
No, they're rampant, aren't they? And it's probably more uncommon to go out and not see one of these things than it is to see one of these things. But it's all the evidence of a society rejecting God. That's the outcome. And so when you looked at the Gentile world, it was a picture of unrighteousness, wasn't it? Everything that they said and everything that they thought and everything that they did. Go ahead, Danny.
I seen some research that was done on. They asked so many thousand people just recently on how many people attended church or a religious gathering of some kind in the United States during a recent time. And 11% said that they went to church on Sunday or sometimes multiple times, like on Wednesday evening, Sunday morning, Sunday evening, that kind of stuff. 11%. How many went once in a while, like on a monthly basis, and it was like 6%. And the remainder, it was, like 70 to 80% didn't go at all. And they were comparing years.
Yeah.
How over the years that, we're getting farther and farther away, it seems like, from just having an affiliation with church going, but still yet 98% of the population believes that there's a superior being of some kind.
Yeah. They at least claim they do. You know, I think their actions are inconsistent with that in a lot of ways, but yeah.
Just like these people, their actions were pretty inconsistent with what they needed to do.
You know, just kind of down the line, Danny's talked about, if you look back 100 years or even 75 years ago, most people were religious and majority attended some church of some kind, and the homes were religious. And as we got less and less religious, you see the moral decline more and more and more. Till stuff is out in the open that there were people that did stuff back then, but it was hidden, and there wasn't very many.
Yeah.
Homosexuality and stuff like that. Now it's just out in the open. So as we got farther away from Christianity and worshiping God, our moral decline has went downhill pretty severely till this would be a pretty good description of the United States now.
Yeah, it would. And again, it's just a natural consequence, isn't it? It's a natural progression of rejecting what you know to be true. And if you're going to reject what you know to be true, I mean, you know, if you're going to claim there is no God, I don't have to answer to a higher being. Who do I have to answer to? You? You know, myself? You know, that makes it a lot less serious, doesn't it? But that was, again, the state that Paul's describing here is a state of unrighteousness. And so he's talking to the church at Rome specifically, but he's saying, I mean, when you look at the Gentile world, you can see that they're in unrighteousness, no doubt. So, any comments or thoughts there on chapter 1 before we move on? Okay, so Paul's just talked about the Gentile world. I mentioned he kind of draws this distinction in the letter here, because that was kind of the natural way of thinking in that day and age. There was a distinction between a Jew and a Gentile. So here's the Gentiles. They're in a state of unrighteousness. Now, what about the Jews? You know, what is their condition? And so that's what he really begins dealing with here in chapter 2. And the Jews were, one of the things that they were famous for were judging other people. What was the problem with the kind of judgment that the Jews used?
They didn't use the judgment of God.
Okay, they didn't use the judgment of God?
They're practicing the same thing.
Yeah, they were condemning people for doing certain things, and then they turn around doing them themselves. You know, so that was kind of one of the things that the Jews were known for in that day and age. Now, I know that wasn't every Jew, but, you know, kind of in general or as a whole, that was kind of the mindset of these people. You know, you're going to be lost. You're going to be, you're going to go to hell for doing that. And then they turn around and they do the same thing. Well, when we judge others for what we do ourselves, that's question number 10 here. What does that do to us? Condemns us, doesn't it? I mean, if we judge somebody for doing something, you say, you know, that's wrong, you're in sin, you're lost because of that, you're going to go to hell because of that, and then I turn around and do the very same thing, what does that say about my condition? Well, I'm no different than they are, am I? You know, I'm in the same situation that they are. And so you have this state where Paul's discussing, you know, the Jews think they're better off than everybody else, but when they're practicing the very things that they're condemning in the lives of others, it's obvious that they're going to be in condemnation themselves. They're in a state of unrighteousness. And, you know, basically when you think about the Jews and their mindset, I guess it would kind of describe it, you could describe it in a way that they kind of thought they got a free pass with sin because they were God's people. In other words, they were the descendants of Abraham. You know, they were in a covenant with God, and so they could go out and do and live and however they want, and God was just going to overlook it. But again, the point that Paul's driving here is, if you're condemning somebody for doing something and you turn around and you do the very same thing that you're condemning them for, you're basically condemning yourself. You're showing that you're in a state of unrighteousness. And, one of the things that Paul talks about is what the state of the Jew was relative to their relationship with God, and how the law of Moses kind of came into that picture, and what it did for the Jew and what it didn't do for the Jew. But, there's no doubt that, do you think God expected more from the Jewish nation than he expected from other nations?
You mean in the time of the Mosaic law?
Yeah. Why would that be the case? Why would we think that would be the case?
Well, the warning was to the Jew first, and then to the Gentile.
Yeah, it certainly was.
But also, God is no respecter of man.
Okay?
But God gave them a law, and this law detailed what was expected of them. Gentiles didn't have a law, so they were essentially, what does it say, a law unto themselves.
Yeah. So, the Jews, did they share a relationship with God that other people didn't share? Yeah, God had a covenant with them that he didn't have with other nations. God gave them a law that he didn't give to all other nations. And so Paul talks about, that because of these privileges and because of these opportunities, you think God had great expectations for them? Sure. There was an accountability that existed between them and God. I don't know how the best way to describe it is. I don't want to say that he didn't hold other nations accountable, but the opportunities that they were presented and the privileges that they had were greater than other nations. And so God expected, a certain reaction from them and a certain mindset. Paul talks about that as he goes through this chapter. But he also talks about, the stubbornness of the Jews. And that's one of the things that the scripture goes over time and time again. They would rebel against God. God would send prophets. And what would they do to the prophets? Persecute them and kill them, right? And so, question number 11 is, what is God's reaction to our stubbornness? And it's really based upon what he's talking about, the Jews here, their stubbornness.
You're treasuring up something that's just not good.
Yeah, what are you treasuring up? God's wrath and God's judgment. And so you have this picture, and again, the destruction of Jerusalem is a pretty good picture of God's wrath and judgment being poured out on the Jewish nation. But for years and years and years, they've been treasuring up God's wrath. That word, treasuring up, I don't remember if it's the same word, but it's the same concept as 1 Corinthians 16, where Paul talks about verses 1 and 2. He says, "So I give an order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye upon the first day of the week, let every one of them lay by and store." And the idea is storing something up. And of course, when he's talking about the collection for the saints, it's the idea of taking God's part and setting it aside and storing it somewhere, so when the first day of the week comes, you can take it out and then give it to God. But the picture is this, God is merciful to us, and he talks about the goodness of God. God is good to us here in this life. And what's the purpose of God's goodness?
For us to be justified and have a heavenly home.
Yeah, he's trying to lead us to salvation, isn't he? He's trying to get us to recognize that, he wants what's best for us, and he wants us to live eternally in heaven with him. And so he's giving us these opportunities and these privileges to change our lives. The Jews had tremendous opportunities. They had tremendous privileges that were presented to them, but when God presented those opportunities and those privileges, and they stubbornly rejected them, they were taking God's wrath and they were putting it in a place and storing it up, treasuring it up. And one day, God's wrath the treasure house was going to be opened, God's wrath was going to be poured out. All the bad things that they did, all the bad things that they said, for all those things that they've done, God's wrath and judgment was going to be poured out upon them. And you think about the day of judgment, that's the picture of the day of judgment, isn't it? You think about God's wrath and His judgment has been withheld from man for so long, but it's being treasured. It's not just disappearing, it's being put in a treasure house. And on the judgment day, that storehouse is going to be opened, and then God's wrath and His judgment is going to be poured out upon man, upon this world. But it's a picture that Paul's painting here of, the reaction of the Jew, and because of their reaction, they were treasuring up the wrath and the judgment of God. They were refusing to repent at His goodness. The fact that He gave them all these special privileges and opportunities, and yet they still weren't changing. They were condemning people and then turning around doing the very same thing that they were condemning them for. So question number 12, how can both the Jew and Gentile expect to be treated by God?
They're both going to die eternally.
Okay? So if a Jew does what is good, how's God going to treat him? Go treat him good. Gentile does what is good, how's God going to treat him? Good. Jew does what is bad, how's God going to treat him? Bad. Gentile does what is bad, how's God going to treat him? Bad. So the answer is God's going to treat us fairly, isn't it? He's not going to treat us unfairly. It doesn't matter what nation we're from, doesn't matter what gender we are, what age group we are, God's going to treat us fairly. And one of the things that Paul points out is God's going to treat us all impartially. And it doesn't matter if you've been a privileged individual in this life or an unprivileged one. God's going to treat us in accordance with what is fair. And so the Jew had the law. They had the law of Moses. They're going to be treated like they had the law of Moses, weren't they? The Gentile didn't have the law of Moses. They were going to be treated like they didn't have the law of Moses. Were they both equally responsible for their sins? Yes. But some were more privileged than others, weren't they? And God was going to treat them and judge them accordingly. So it would be unfair of God if He treated them any differently than what the reality of their situation was in life. And so he points out, it doesn't matter if you're a Jew or a Gentile, you're going to be judged by God and you're going to be judged fairly. He goes on to talk about the relationship of the Jew and the law of Moses, and how that worked, or how that operated in this covenant and this relationship that they had with God. So we already mentioned question 13 there. The special relationship that the Jews had with God was the law of Moses. Moses talks about in Deuteronomy 8 and verse 4. He asks the question, he says, what other nation has God given laws so holy and just and righteous as these? Not every nation was given that, but the Jews were. And so they did have a relationship with God that other nations did not have. But why did God give them that law?
Well, then He give it to some people, help other people.
Yeah, it certainly helped not only the Jew, it also helped the Gentile, didn't it? I think Paul's going to talk a little bit more about that too as he goes on.
The law helped them to know what was right and wrong.
Yeah, it did. And it's really, you think about why does God give us a law today? What does He expect of us? To keep it, right? That's why He gives it to us. God gave the Jews this law. Did He give them this law so they could just carry it around and show everybody, look at this law God gave us. Aren't we special? You don't have this law. God gave it to me, not to you. Did He just give it to them to possess and to brag about?
No, but they sure took advantage of it.
Yeah. That was what they did, right? And they felt special. We have this law that you don't have. God gave us this. And most of the Jews missed the purpose that, hey, God gave you that law to keep it, to live by it, to change you, to make you into different people. Not just so you'd feel special, or not just so you could claim a privilege that nobody else had today. But again, the Jewish mindset was, we're special because we have this law. How does the Jews, question 14 here, how did the Jews describe themselves when it came to their comparison to the Gentiles?
As an instructor or a guide,
Yeah. What did they think about the rest of the world?
this world is inferior to them.
Yeah, they were these blind, walking in the dark, foolish, ignorant people that had no idea about what was going on. Now, you want to know what's going on? Talk to a Jew. Okay, a Jew knew, didn't they? They had the knowledge. They described themselves. If you wanted to see something, you need to be shown something. Come talk to me. I'm a Jew. I'll show you. Or if you need guidance, come to me. I'll guide you. You need some instruction? I can instruct you. You need me to teach you something? I can teach you. And so they had this aura of confidence that we're so much better than everybody else. Everybody else is ignorant and foolish and living in darkness and in sin. And we're these knowledgeable people, and we know all these things, and we can teach other people. We can guide them to the light. But what they failed to see is, again, it wasn't just knowing the law that made them special. What was supposed to make them special?
Not just outward, but inward obedience.
Yeah, it was keeping the law, wasn't it? That's what was going to make them special. That's what was going to make them different and unique from everybody else. I think about that idea as Christians. I think sometimes as Christians, we can be kind of guilty of that same concept, don't you? Because we think, well, we know. And, if somebody's in darkness, we can teach them the truth. And it's important. Listen, knowledge is essential to our salvation, isn't it? But what's equally important?
We're practicing it.
Practicing what you know, right? And that's where the Jew failed. It wasn't just the possession of the law that made them special. It was actually the keeping of the law. Again, I think as Christians, sometimes we say, well, I've been baptized, right? So I got this free pass with God. I can just go out and live however I want to live. Why did God give us a law? Keep it, right? Or sometimes we might think, well, I'm at every church service. Every time the doors are open, I'm there. Okay? Is there any other laws that God gave us to keep? It's not just one that makes us special or stand out from everybody else. It's all of them together. And it's not to minimize baptism or church attendance or the Lord's Supper or anything like that. Just as when you read the law of Moses, I don't think God would have minimized the act of circumcision, do you? But that wasn't the whole law. It was just a part of it. And just because you kept a part of it didn't mean that you were keeping the law.
How do you measure devoutness? And it's not necessarily about attendance. It's not about necessarily the wisdom, because or the knowledge base that you have. It's if you don't apply it to yourself and be able to help others to see that, then the knowledge doesn't help. It has to be the wisdom of being able to apply it.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I think, how many different religions of the world see their religion as their traditional, cultural, whatever religion, and leave God out of it? I mean, they don't really follow, or they just follow part of it. It's
Yeah.
convenient for them.
Yeah. And, again, I think about the Jews here. They were, again, they were God's chosen people. But today, that's us. When the world looks at us, what makes us special? Is it just because I've been underwater over here, or just because I show up at the church building every day, or whenever the doors are open? That's part of it. But there's a lot of other laws that God gives us. And, that's the reason God gives us to them, is to keep them. And that's what's going to make us distinct or different. And somewhere along the line, the Jews kind of lost sight of that. They just kind of fell into this idea, well, we're circumcised, we can do whatever we want to do now. We're in a covenant relationship with God. So how does Paul, question 15, how does Paul redefine what it means to be a Jew?
A Jew inside, spiritual Jews, please.
Yeah, it's not the outward, is it? Not the outward cutting away, it's the inward cutting. And of course, question 16, we kind of already talked about that, but what's just as important as knowing God's written law? Applying it, it's practicing it in our life. That's true Christianity. True Christianity is inward. It's not just one outward act that we do, but it's an attitude of submission and humility and obedience. And that's really what it means to be a Christian. I'm applying God's law and practicing God's law in my life. And Paul's using that, or he's going to use that as a springboard for a discussion of righteousness. What does it mean to be a righteous individual? And he's going to talk about the idea of living for the flesh versus living for the spirit, the spiritual things. Living for fleshly things versus living for spiritual things. And as a Christian, there should be some conduct in our lives that again, manifests itself that we're living for the spiritual side of things, not the fleshly. So when we get in chapter 6 and 7 and 8, we'll talk some more about that. But I really wanted to start the next one, but I didn't make it. But Lord willing, next week we're not gonna make this a habit, so we're gonna go through both chapters. Or I'm gonna do my best to get through both of them. I'll put it that way. Anybody got any thoughts, comments, or questions for me?
Everybody's back on chapter 1. Earlier in the chapter is specifically mentioned Greeks name, and then later on talk about the images. Was he, and the Greek Gentiles also, was he really getting on them specifically? Do that, you think, or is it just?
Well, sometimes, I don't know without looking at the original language, but sometimes when that word Greeks is used there, it's actually talking about the Jews who spoke Greek. So maybe he's talking about a different group of people that when the Jews looked at them, they wouldn't consider them Jewish because they spoke Greek. If you were a true Jew, you spoke Hebrew and you did certain things. So they would have kind of considered them outside their social circle. But I don't know. I'd have to look at the original language to see what word is used there. Not sure.
The Greeks, they love their idols.
Yeah.
And their God. I just curious if he was just really concerned about how that fits. The Jews or Greeks and barbarians, but all of which they would all be Gentiles.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there was a certain group of people who would be considered Greeks too, Grecians. So maybe that's what he's referring to.
I just curious who he was referring to back there.
Yeah. Maybe it's that specific group. Because like you said, they were big on philosophy, weren't they? Some of the major philosophers of that day and age would have come from the Grecian culture and background. And then you'd have the barbarians, the rest of the foreign world. So maybe that's the comparison that he's using there.
The Greeks were they were the learned people.
Oh yeah, yeah, they were
Their attitude too.
They were the philosophical people, weren't they, of that day and age?
It almost seems like philosophy would have been different at that time. Easier to be a philosopher than it would be.
I don't know what the credentials were, do you?
Well, it's just it. There was no standard that they had to follow. They could be certain things. Hey, I'm a philosopher, and here's what I think.
Yeah.
And, people would just go, oh, this guy was good.
Based on the number of people that followed you, that told you how good of a philosopher you were, I guess.